everyone, and welcome to this video on editing your essay. So this video is going to be relevant for your area of study, belonging, and particularly is aimed at students studying Year 12 ESL English. This video is going to be split into two parts. In the first part, we'll be introducing these ideas and then developing them in more detail in part 2 of this video. So today, to look at editing your essay, we're really going to be examining 4 different areas. So those 4 areas are, firstly, basic tips for editing after you write. So those sort of tips that you can use to improve your writing as a whole. Secondly, we'll be looking at understanding and editing by using things like grammar. So we're really going to be looking at these rules in detail and looking at how you can use those to improve your essay. Thirdly, we're going to be looking at things which you can remove and also add to your essay writing. So once you produce that final essay, what are the things you can take out and what are the things which you should be leaving in and emphasizing? And finally, we'll be looking at how to use vocabulary successfully in order to produce an essay which is sophisticated in its form and style. So let's begin by looking at editing your essay and the editing process. So when you first write your essay, it's going to look nothing like your final product. And this is really important to realize from the very beginning. Your essay which you write at your first try is never going to be up to that standard which you're going to have as soon as you hand it in. So there's a lot of editing process which you really need to undertake. Editing, therefore, is the method of improving and changing your essay after you write it. So realizing that what you write at the beginning isn't going to be your final product and how to get to that final product. That's what we're going to be looking at today. Your first priority, obviously, is producing a draft essay. So once you're familiar with your text, once you've done some analysis in class, and then gone away and chosen your related text, you really need to start thinking about producing that draft essay. So that's your first priority at this point. So once you've got to that point where you've written your essay and you feel like it's at that standard that you want other people to read it and to get some feedback perhaps, that's where you're going to be starting to think about what other people think, not just what you think. So when you're using feedback, it's really important to remember that this is going to be the first step in the editing process. So it's not the only step, but it's definitely a really important one for you. So you can give your essay to teachers and also tutors and parents to examine and just to give you some feedback on. It's really important to remember the more people who've read your essay, the better quality it's going to be. Just merely because the more people who contribute is just going to bring it to that higher standard. It's also important that once you do this editing and you're handing it out to people for feedback, you're doing that one at a time. So by this, what I mean is not handing it out to a number of people all at once, but instead to hand it out to one person to take their feedback, fix your essay up, and then hand it to the next person and then repeat that over and over again. Because there's no point in handing it out to, say, 7 people all at once and then having to deal with 7 different people's opinions on that one essay and dealing with juggling all those suggestions. So do it one at a time. It's going to make the process a lot smoother for you. It's also really important for you to remember that editing is half of that essay writing process. So you really want to be spending the same amount of time on your editing as you actually did on producing and writing the essay in the first place. So it's really a 2-part process, and editing shouldn't be rushed and forgotten about. It's also really important that you don't be offended by the editing process. So when people are giving you suggestions, suggesting changes and things like that which you can make, it's really important that you understand that your first draft is going to be messy, and that's not a reflection that you're a bad English student or anything. It's just a reflection that it's a first draft and that's always going to be a bit messy. So once you're getting that suggestion, you're using that to improve your essay and to get to a better essay state, rather than feeling like it's a whole lot of criticism that you can't handle. It's also important to remember that multiple perspectives are going to really provide you with sophistication and deeper analysis. So a number of perspectives on a text, for example, is going to mean that you have a greater pool of analysis and a more sophisticated understanding. So that's really going to help you. So let's now take a look at the steps of editing. So it's really important that when you're going about the editing process, you're doing this in an orderly way. So you're not just, sitting down and trying to change everything at once, but instead you're following these steps to really ensure that the process is undertaken smoothly and correctly. So firstly, you need to understand that when you finish writing an essay, there's more to come. As we've discussed, the actual writing process is not the final product. Instead, you need to use editing to really improve that final product and get it to the standard that you want to have once you're handing in or once you get to the exam. So that's the first step, that mental realization. The second step is to leave the essay for about an hour and then come back to it. So once you've actually written your essay, it's a really good idea to sort of step away from it. Once you've finished writing, you're really in that state of mind where it seems like it's perfect and that you couldn't make any changes to make it even better. That's obviously not the case. If you take a step away, go away for an hour, read a book, watch some TV, have dinner or whatever, then come back to the essay and you'll see that those changes and those edits are really going to be jumping out at you. And editing's going to be a lot easier for you once you get to that stage where you have a bit of separation from your essay. The third step then is to prune each sentence and make sure that keywords, topic sentences and grammar are all correct and as they should be. And we're going to be looking at each of these in detail a bit later in this video. Fourth, you then need to give your essay to someone to edit and apply their suggestions, and then repeat this, as we said, a number of times to ensure that you get a lot of perspective on your essay. So obviously you're not going to have a whole lot of time to do this if you're just doing this the night before. So it's really important that when you're writing an essay, you make sure you have a couple of weeks in advance of that due date to make sure that you can not only write it, but really edit it sufficiently and have time to get the feedback from people you're giving it to and then apply that feedback. So leave enough time for this process. So now let's take a look at what to cut from your essay. So it's really a common phenomenon that once you've finished writing your essay, you think that everything in there is completely relevant and absolutely going to get you good marks. However, that's not always the case. When you first write an essay, often the things you're including aren't maybe the best things for you to be including. So the first things which you need to cut are words or sentences which you don't really need. So there's this old expression which is kill your darlings. So by that, what we mean is, any quotes, any sentences, any sort of long fancy words, which you're including sort of just for the sake of it or just because you personally like them, you need to be cutting those out if they're not explicitly answering the question. So it's really important to make sure that what you have on the page answers the question, not just are things which you like the best. You then need to focus on what is relevant, not what sounds good. So that's extending on that concept even more. Secondly, you need to make sure that you have a really focused train of thought. So that's going to mean you're cutting out any of those really blurry, airy-fairy things which aren't making your essay exactly to the relevance and also to that sophistication level which it should be. So for example, you always want to be focusing on the key issue. So always bringing it back to the question or your thesis statement. You then want to be removing contradictions. So if you have any places in your argument where the two elements of your argument don't work well with each other, you want to be removing those clashes there. You also want to be ensuring that you have a sleek, logical argument. So by this, you want to be ensuring that you're cutting away all of that sort of material which is irrelevant, which is just there to look good but perhaps doesn't add to your argument. So ensuring that you really trim down your argument and get it to that excellent standard, such as which you'll see in your thesis statement. You also want to be cutting out repetition. Now, it's all very good to have ideas and be repeating them, but it can get to the point where, you have a limited word limit and you have so much to say that you don't want to be repeating things over and over again and wasting that time and those words that you have to show off your skills. So you want to be avoiding repetition of phrases when discussing ideas and themes. So specific phrases and keywords, obviously you're keeping in keywords from the question and from the rubric, but anything that's not explicitly under that heading you want to be getting rid of if you're repeating it a lot. You also never repeat quotes. This is just a really bad idea because it shows the marker that you're underprepared and that you haven't done your research. So showing off a variety of quotes is a really good way of making sure that the marker understands that you do have that good level of analysis and that you have read your text really well and taken away a wide range of quotes from it, not just a couple of quotes which you can say over and over again. It's also really important that you don't repeat techniques too many times. Again, you really want to show off your diversity to the marker. So rather than choosing quotes that only show off one technique, choose a whole lot of different quotes that really show off your skills to the marker in that way. You should also be using a variety of conjunctions and adjectives, just to add some sophistication in your language to your marker. So that's a really good way of ensuring that you achieve that. You also shouldn't be repeating, obviously, those fleshy phrases which don't make sense or aren't relevant, but you do want to be repeating keywords, and that includes things from the question and the rubric. They're the things that the marker is going to be ticking, thinking this is great, she's answering the question, and that's what you always want to be coming back to. So that's what you obviously need to include, and you do not want to be cutting. So now you've taken out all of these things from your essay. It might be looking a bit short, it might be looking like it's not at that quality which you expected your essay to be. But that's alright, because once you've taken things out, that's where you're starting to add things in. And you're really growing your essay and building it up to that point of sophistication and a high standard. So you're adding firstly your thesis. Now you want to be placing emphasis on this thesis and making sure that it's in every paragraph, including your introduction and your conclusion. Not just putting it in your introduction and never mentioning it again, but always coming back to it. Secondly, you want to be including a lot of references to the rubric. So always making sure that you're coming back to the rubric and demonstrating to the marker that you know what this area of study is about for you. You also want to be including references to use of language. So if you don't feel like you've got enough language techniques or quotes in there, they're definitely things which you can add for the marker to really feel like you have a sophisticated and detailed understanding. You also need to add techniques and quotes. So this is where you're going to be getting your marks through detail, and that's what you really want to be using. Fifthly, you can also be adding jargon. Now, jargon is obviously really important because it means you can replace really general terms with more specific ones. So by this, for example, instead of just using really bland language techniques such as imagery or descriptive language, use more specific ones, so things like metonymy, caesura, and anaphora. Those demonstrate that you have a more sophisticated, deeper level of understanding, and that's something which the rubric is asking of you. So it's a really good idea to develop that. You also want to be including context in the things that you're adding. So this means that it's going to be no more than a sentence, but is going to alert the marker to context. So making sure that you understand the work and that you have that sort of social, historical background, which means that you're going to understand the work at that deeper level. And making sure that the marker knows that you have that background knowledge and that you've done your research. You also need to work on phrasing. So for example, you can use interesting language, adjectives, and vary your sentence length. Things like that which are going to make the level of your language more sophisticated and more interesting for the marker to read. And that's going to mean that you're more likely to be getting higher marks once the marker's reading your response. You also want to be focusing on grammar, so we're going to be looking at that later in this video, but including dashes, colons and semicolons to show that you have skills in grammatical construction. So now let's take a look at tips for using language in essays. So language is obviously one of those things which we've discussed as really important in applying and using in your essay to make sure you stand out. So it's more sophisticated if you use third person. So this is just a habit which you really need to get in the habit of. It's more formal language and more acceptable in that essay format. So it's what you want to really be using. It also adheres to the formal style required of essay writing. So it's that sort of academic convention which you want to get into the habit of. You also need to think about your vocabulary. And we'll look at this in a little more detail later, but basically you need to use your thesaurus cautiously. So don't use words which you don't understand, but if you do understand them and they are adding interest and variety, then definitely go ahead and use them. You also shouldn't be using unfamiliar words because often if you do this, you're going to be using them incorrectly, and that's just going to make your essay really hard to understand and not make any sense. It's also really important that you understand the usage of words before you start applying them to that use of your essay. So, for example, if you don't understand a word that you've looked up in the thesaurus, or you think it has a similar meaning but aren't quite sure, do some more research into that word before you actually use it in your essay. You then need to ensure that you focus on grammar. So this means that you ensure that you're going to be using grammar correctly and accurately. So this means that you're going to be making use of things like dashes and semicolons, which are just a bit more sophisticated in grammar. So that's going to be really useful for you. You can also be making use of, for example, your computer grammar check. Now, handwriting might seem easier, but if you're using the computer, that's going to really benefit you because it's going to be telling you what sort of things to take out and what to add in. And really just making sure that your essay is grammatically correct in every way. So now let's take a look at the specific ways in which you can examine those grammar rules and apply them to your essay. So dashes are one example of something which is that more sophisticated level of grammar than, say, a full stop or a question mark. So dashes are used to indicate a pause, a break in thought, or a change in thought. You actually refer to them as an em dash. So if, say, for example, you're doing a comprehension section, that's what you should refer to it as. So you can replace some commas with dashes to create a more sophisticated sentence, just to show the marker that you're not resting on really pedestrian grammatical techniques, but that you're mixing it up with things like dashes. So for example, you can add dashes to replace a comma. So this sentence, Jamie, comma, who fainted during his wedding, comma, apologized to his wife by booking tickets to New York. We see here that we can use dashes instead, just to create more of that sense of pause. So Jamie, dash, creates a longer pause, who fainted during his wedding, apologized to his wife by booking tickets to New York. We're just getting that longer sense of pause, which is going to be achieved through the dash. We can also use it to replace a colon. So he blamed his divorce on one thing, beer. You can change it and use that as a dash just to lengthen that pause a bit more, just to, for example, add emphasis or perhaps demonstrate to the reader that one word in your sentence is particularly important. Again, you can also use dashes to replace semicolons to lengthen that pause. So, the sales team meet on Tuesdays, unlike the floor managers who meet on Wednesdays. If you change that to a dash, you really get the sense that this is a pause and you're really separating these ideas out a bit more. Similarly, you can use colons. Now, these are used to extend a long sentence. And additionally, they're used to introduce a long quotation, which is more than 6 words long. So if you're using a short quotation, you wouldn't be using a colon, but if you are using a long one of 6 words plus, that's where you want to be putting a colon in. It's also really important in essay writing to correctly introduce and structure your quotations. And this is through things like colons. And we're going to just take a look now at how to use those. So for example, you can use them to extend a sentence. So belonging comes down to 2 elements, colon, the individual and the community. So you're making sure that you're not just using 2 sentences, but you're combining 2 into 1 through use of that colon. You can also see that a dash here could be used, however a colon is also acceptable. You can also use the colon to introduce a quotation, as we stated. So, use of historical allusion can be seen in Strzelecki's poetry, colon, pegging my tents further and further south of Hadrian's Wall. Now, comma is used if you're not having that long sentence in. If the quote, for example, is short rather than up to 6 words long. So the metaphor, pegging my tents, is used to show the persona's sense of guilt. Here you use the comma because the quote you're introducing is short and doesn't require that pause for the reader. Semicolons are the final sort of grammatical area which you can add. So when you're looking at semicolons, it's really important to notice that these are used when two parts of a sentence are separate yet related. So these can be used to replace conjunctions, so things like but, you can replace with a semicolon to split up those areas of the sentence. These are similar to colons when used to connect long sentences. However, the pause isn't quite so extensive, it's more of a brief pause. So these are sort of grammatical things which you should be thinking about. And by adding things like these semicolons, colons and dashes, you're really on your way to creating grammatical sophistication, and that's what you want to be aiming for. So this brings us to the end of part 1 of our 2-part video. Join us in part 2 to extend our ideas on how to edit our essay.